10 years ago, Rockwell National Forest, with its towering ancient pines and thick morning fog blanketing the ground like a cold, heavy shroud, became the focus of statewide attention when 14-year-old Nathan Cole vanished without a trace during a family camping trip. A bright student who loved nature and dreamed of becoming a biologist, Nathan's dreams were abruptly cut short on a gloomy afternoon when he told his parents he was going to the stream to wash his hands, and never returned. His family searched, and a full-scale rescue mission was underway within hours. People, scent dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging, everything converged on Rockwell, clinging to the hope that the boy was still alive somewhere in the cold, dark woods. Caleb Sullivan was barely in his 20s then, a newly appointed ranger facing his first major search operation. He still remembers that first night, the flashlight beam flickering across moss-covered trunks, the wind howling through the branches like whispered voices hiding in the shadows. Caleb trekked over 20 miles around the last spot Nathan was seen, following the stream, wading through icy mud, calling the boy's name hundreds of times, holding on to the belief that sheer persistence could bring him back into his mother's arms. But all he found was a handkerchief faintly smelling of campfire smoke, some smudged footprints in the rotting leaves, and the unbearable silence of a forest that refused to speak. The search lasted nearly 2 weeks, and when it ended, there were no answers. Nobody. No clues. Not a single explanation. It was as if the forest had swallowed Nathan whole, his name etched into the long list of lost souls Rockwell had quietly kept through generations. For the media, it was another mystery, soon replaced by hotter headlines. For the community, a tragedy that slowly faded with time. But for Caleb, it was a wound that never closed. He stayed in the forest, continued to patrol its trails, to guard its secrets. But every year, on the exact day Nathan disappeared, Caleb would return to that same clearing by the stream, the last place where the boy had left a trace. He would stand there, staring into the dense trees, heart heavy with the same unanswered question. What did I miss? Could he be just steps away, buried beneath the earth, silently waiting for someone to come back? They say the forest remembers, and Caleb believes it. On quiet nights, lying in his modest ranger cabin, he sometimes hears small footsteps brushing past the porch, or a whisper in the mist repeating the name he's never been able to forget. Nathan. For a decade, the boy's disappearance haunted him like a ghost, not just because he had failed to bring Nathan home, but because, deep down, Caleb sensed the forest still held the truth. What he didn't know was that one crisp autumn morning, the truth would finally begin to surface, not through a human's efforts, but through a loyal creature with upright ears, a miraculous nose, and a heart that refused to give up. Her name was Aspen. That morning, as the sun struggled to break through the dense canopy and mist curled like smoke around the ancient pines, veteran ranger Caleb Sullivan stood at the edge of Rockwell Forest. But his gaze held more than the usual alertness of a forest guard. Beneath his calm exterior stirred an old, undying weight. It was on a morning just like this, 10 years ago, that Nathan Cole had disappeared into the forest's chilling silence. Caleb had walked mile after mile for days, calling the boy's name until his voice gave out. But the forest offered nothing in return. No remains, no clues, just a brutal, unrelenting quiet. Not far from where Caleb stood, near the center of the training area, Officer Lydia Mercer was fastening the harness on her unique partner, a German shepherd named Aspen. With charcoal gray fur and deep, intelligent eyes, Aspen was no ordinary working dog. She carried an aura about her, as if an old soul hid behind her calm, loyal demeanor. For 3 years, Lydia and Aspen had been inseparable, solving difficult cases together, from missing persons to cold investigations. But this morning, something felt off. Aspen didn't bounce or nuzzle like she usually did. Instead, she stood stiff, eyes locked on the forest, as if something deep within was calling her from beyond the mist. Lydia gently ran her hand down Aspen's muscular back, masking her concern. "What's wrong, girl? It's just a routine drill today." But Aspen didn't respond. Not with a bark, a whine, or even a glance. A chill ran down Lydia's spine. Not from the cold, but from the way Aspen stared, as if she smelled something ancient, wild, and sorrowful lingering in the fog. Sergeant Dominic Carter, the commanding officer for the training exercise, approached. His face, always stern, paused a moment longer than usual on Aspen. He was the type who trusted discipline over instinct, procedures over feelings, and had little patience for Lydia's bond with her dog. "Check the lead. Don't let her act on her own again," he snapped, then walked off, not waiting for a reply. Lydia swallowed her retort. She was used to it. She knew Aspen only broke protocol when it truly mattered. Still, she rechecked the leash, adjusted the GPS tracker, and clipped the locator tag to Aspen's collar. The drill seemed straightforward. Locate 6 simulated bodies buried at different depths in tough terrain. Accuracy, reaction, and scent identification were the focus. Speed was not. Aspen began as usual, nose close to the ground, zigzagging through the foliage, ears twitching like live radars. But just minutes in, she stopped. Her head lifted, eyes fixed beyond the boundary of the training area, into the thick wildwoods. She took one deep breath, then, without warning, darted off. Not toward a marked zone, but deep into the forest, crashing through brush and fallen trees like something unseen was pulling her forward. "Aspen!" Lydia shouted, signaling with a trained gesture. But the dog didn't even glance back. She had broken orders before, rarely, and each time had led to something unexpected and vital. Lydia's gut told her this wasn't a drill gone wrong. This was a call, ancient and real. She glanced at Sergeant Carter, whose glare was sharp with disapproval. But Lydia didn't hesitate. She took off after her dog, her boots crunching over dead leaves, each step taking her closer not to a mock target, but to a truth buried for 10 years. And so, on a morning that should have been routine, one woman and her loyal dog stepped off the path drawn for them, and into the heart of a mystery that still pulsed beneath the cold soil, where the silence of the past was about to be broken by a nose that never failed and a heart that never turned away from the truth. The air grew heavier as Lydia crossed the invisible line between the training zone and the untouched wildwood, a part of the forest where every branch and root intertwined like the silent spine of a memory nature had buried deep. Beneath her boots, thick layers of decaying leaves whispered in dry rustles, as if the earth itself were murmuring secrets, blending with Aspen's heavy breathing as the dog hurried forward. But her gait was different now. Not the calm, methodical movement of a trained working dog, but something urgent, primal, almost ancient, a pull only she could feel, something beyond training or command. Sergeant Carter, still tracking their GPS signals, barked through the radio, his voice cold and sharp like cracked stone. "Mercer, this is your final warning. Return to the designated area. Your dog is compromising the entire training structure. That behavior is unacceptable." He didn't yell, but the tightness in his voice made it clear this wasn't just about rules. It was the culmination of 3 years of built-up disdain. To Carter, deviation was defiance, and instinct was disorder. He had no patience for emotion, especially not in a program rooted in military discipline. Lydia paused in a bed of ferns, inhaled deeply, and pressed the radio button. "I understand, sir, but Aspen doesn't behave like this unless something's seriously wrong. I take full responsibility. Please, trust me." She could almost picture Carter's jaw clenching, the vein in his neck twitching at this act of disobedience from the junior officer he'd always deemed too soft. But Lydia no longer cared about his approval. Her only focus was Aspen, the dog she once fought to keep from being discarded as unmanageable, and who, in return, had given her unwavering loyalty. They didn't need commands. They had trust. Aspen had stopped in a small clearing strewn with decomposing leaves and twisted roots, her body trembling like a bowstring stretched to its limit, eyes fixed on a shallow depression in the ground. Then, without warning, she began to dig, not the eager digging of a reward-driven exercise, but sharp, desperate thrusts of her paws, frantic and focused. Lydia rushed over, dropped to her knees, and placed a hand on Aspen's shoulder. She could feel the dog's heartbeat pounding like a drum, hot and wild. "What is it, girl?" she whispered, her voice catching. Aspen turned, and for a brief second their eyes locked, the dog's gaze full of urgency, saying what words could not. Lydia knew instantly. This place wasn't random. This wasn't a drill gone wrong. Something, or someone, had once been here. Footsteps thundered behind her. Carter emerged from the undergrowth, face stiff with fury, coat flapping as he stormed over. "Mercer, what the hell do you think you're doing? Do you even realize how many protocols you've just—" But he didn't finish. His eyes fell on Aspen, not defensive, not aggressive, but whining softly, ears flattened, still pawing at the soil, flinging up clumps of earth and mulch, like she was only inches from unearthing something long buried. Carter stepped closer, frowning as his gaze dropped to the ground. The soil beneath Aspen's paws wasn't the dark, damp brown of an untouched forest floor. It was compacted, unnatural, sliced through with severed roots. Anyone with basic forensics training would see it immediately. This ground had been disturbed before. Someone had dug here. "Get me a shovel," Lydia snapped at a nearby trainee rushing up the path. Aspen let out soft, broken whimpers now, each dig followed by a glance at Lydia, pleading, urgent. As the first shovel bit into the soil, Lydia felt the forest hold its breath. By the third stroke, a sharp clunk echoed, metal against something harder than earth. All three froze. They knew. A question that had gone unanswered for 10 years had just begun to speak. Not with words, not with evidence, but with dirt-covered paws and the unwavering heart of a dog who had sensed what humans chose to ignore. And this was only the beginning of a truth that would change everything. The dry clack of the shovel hitting an object stopped Lydia's breath, and somehow the forest seemed to go still with her. The mist-hung air, already dense, now thickened with something sharper, a tension that tingled against the skin and scraped the nerves raw. Aspen whimpered again, her cries soft but pressing, urging. Her paws still clawed the sunken ground where the soil had taken on a strange hue, ashen, softer, reeking of something old and sorrowful. Lydia dropped beside the pit, pulled off her gloves, and began clearing the earth with her bare hands, gently brushing away the layers like unveiling a secret that had waited far too long. It took less than 3 minutes before she knew. This was no rock, no root. It was a hand, more precisely fingers, human, pale, partially decomposed but still visibly human, bone and nail emerging from the silence of soil to scream a truth that could no longer be buried. Someone had died here, alone, in this forgotten corner of the woods. Carter was frozen. The hardness in his face drained into something ghost-white, his eyes locked on the body part, as if the world had slipped beyond anything he could control or even comprehend. In over 20 years of working with K9 units, he had never seen a dog disobey protocol out of pure instinct. And be right. Somewhere beneath the shock, Carter must have felt the sting of being proven wrong by both a subordinate and a dog he had deemed too difficult. But louder still was the quiet dread of what they had uncovered. Lydia gently gripped Aspen's shoulder, her eyes meeting the dog's for a moment that needed no words. It was a thank you. It was recognition that if not for Aspen, if not for this stubborn, relentless loyalty, the truth would have stayed buried beneath layers of rot, time, and human neglect. She reached up, pressed the emergency call button on her radio. "Dispatch, this is Mercer. We've located a real body. Possible homicide. Immediate lockdown of scene required. Requesting forensics, investigators, full assessment team. Coordinates to follow." The message took seconds to send, but the impact was seismic. A body, unidentified, without ID or trace, buried in a training forest assumed safe for years. It rocked the system, exposed the blind spots of long-held assumptions. The very forest they'd chosen for its controlled environment now stood as proof of how easily silence could hide the truth. As yellow "Do Not Cross" tape stretched between moss-covered trees, and investigators arrived with flashlights, cameras, and evidence bags, Aspen remained at the edge of the pit. She no longer dug. She no longer whined. She sat still, guarding, not the body but the truth now surfacing, finally seen. Her ears twitched occasionally, but her eyes never wavered, as if she were still listening for a voice beneath the soil, a whisper from the missing, reminding the world that they had never truly vanished, only waited for someone to care enough to listen and dig deep enough to reach them. When a forensic officer finally confirmed, the remains appeared to be male, adolescent, likely between 16 and 18 years old. Cause of death undetermined, buried approximately 14 inches deep. Signs of manual concealment. Lydia turned away, her fingers tightening around Aspen's lead. She felt as though they had opened a door, and behind it lay not just one answer, but a trail of forgotten memories waiting to be unearthed. And then, a chilling thought took hold. Could this be the forest's answer to a decade-old silence? The very silence that followed the disappearance of Nathan Cole? She didn't dare be sure, but Lydia knew this much. Aspen had done what no human had, found the voice buried beneath the quiet. And this was only the beginning. As the forensic team began setting up a field tent and artificial lights to cut through the dim, heavy shade of the dense forest, Lydia remained beside Aspen, her eyes tracking every careful movement the specialists made as they unearthed the earth around the body. Each shovel of soil, each layer peeled back, felt like revealing fragments of a secret that time had sealed away. With every inch uncovered, the truth edged closer to the surface, enough to hush even the most seasoned officers. In the soil, tangled with roots and thick with the stench of decay, the body of a teenage boy gradually emerged, a frail arm, a tattered dark green jacket marked by faint claw scratches, and a face partially decomposed but still holding the soft contours of a youth whose life had been cut short. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. This was no accident. This was not a lost hiker. This was a burial. When a worn, half-rotted backpack was found beside the body, the forensic team paused to examine it on the spot. In a mud-caked side pocket, they discovered a plastic student ID card, edges frayed but the name still clearly legible. Ryan Hollister, Westlake High School. The air froze. Carter lowered his head, his expression faltering as he heard the name. A name that had once been broadcast across local news, printed on hundreds of flyers taped to bus stops and supermarket bulletin boards. Ryan Hollister, 17, had gone missing 4 months ago during a solo hiking trip in Crestwood Park, nearly 20 miles from where they now stood. All the earlier theories, disorientation, a fall, wild animals, evaporated like mist. Someone had brought Ryan here, and someone had made sure no one would find him. Lydia looked at the boy's body beneath the forest floor. He was no longer just a name on a missing persons flyer. He was a teenager with dreams, with friends and a family. Someone who should have been spending his senior year preparing for college or prom, not lying cold in the ground, found only because of a dog during a training session that was never meant to lead here. She knelt beside Aspen and ran her hand gently over the dog's head. Under her fingers, Aspen trembled with tension, but her eyes stayed locked on the body as if still guarding it, as if making sure the boy, silent for so long, was finally heard. In the distance, the wail of sirens and forensic vans grew louder. A nondescript SUV rolled slowly down the narrow forest path and came to a stop at the scene. A middle-aged man stepped out with hurried steps, Detective Marcus Whitley, who had once led Ryan's case before it was shelved due to insufficient suspicion. His face turned ashen as he was led to the body, and after a long, silent moment of observation, he spoke, barely audible, just loud enough for Lydia to hear. 4 months. We searched in that direction for 20 miles. No one ever thought of Rockwell. Whitley immediately ordered the area locked down, a mobile command center set up, and more forensic teams dispatched. He suspected the site could hold further evidence. But what caught Lydia's attention wasn't the urgency. It was the way he looked at Carter. A cold glance, not just of anger, but one that seemed to say, "This happened because you believed too much in rules and too little in instinct." Lydia understood. This wasn't training anymore. This was real. And she and Aspen were the ones who had cracked open a shell of deception that had hidden the truth for 4 long months. Carter stepped aside quietly. For once, he had nothing to say. His face no longer held pride or authority, but confusion, as though everything he had trusted in was crumbling before him. And the one tearing it down was a dog he had once deemed too instinctive to trust. As dusk stretched long shadows between the trees and the creeping cold of the old woods returned, Aspen remained beside the uncovered body, still, alert. She didn't wait for praise. She didn't ask for a reward. All she needed was to know that someone had been found, that the truth had been spoken, and that she had helped bring it to light. Not with words, not with logic, but with her heart, her muddy paws, and an instinct that had never failed her. As the last amber streaks of daylight filtered through the thick pine canopy and Rockwell forest, turned fully into a lit-up crime scene, Lydia stood in silence beside Aspen. Her hand gripped the leash tightly, her mind caught in the storm of everything that had just unfolded. The official investigation was now underway, with forensic teams and specialists moving quietly, like shadows with purpose. Detective Whitley combed through missing persons reports on a laptop balanced on a car hood. Everyone was busy, but Lydia felt as if she were standing on the edge of something far bigger than a single crime. It wasn't just about the death of a teenager. It was confirmation of something she had long believed, that sometimes the instincts of a loyal creature could cut through rules tighter than steel. She removed her gloves, her hands still trembling from the aftermath. Then she reached into her coat and found a name in her contacts list, one she'd only dialed a few times in the past 3 years. Master Sergeant Reed Calloway, Aspen's original trainer, and the man who once told her something she'd never forgotten. She's not breaking the rules. She's just ahead of us. While others, Carter included, had dismissed Aspen as too independent, too difficult, Calloway had seen something else. To him, Aspen was not a tool limited by training commands, but a sentient being, intelligent, intuitive, and most of all, driven by something deeper. After 3 rings, the line connected, and Calloway's calm, gravelly voice came through. "Mercer, it's been a while. Something happened to the girl?" Lydia drew a deep breath, then began recounting everything: the morning drill, Aspen's sudden defiance, the discovery in the forest. Calloway said nothing, listening in silence as if following every paw step of the dog through memory and instinct. When Lydia finally finished, her voice lowered, edged with emotion. She broke every command, left the course, led me into the woods, and we found a real body, a teenage boy, missing for 4 months. There was a pause, then Calloway replied, slower, deeper, but with a certainty that felt unshakable. "I told you, if she breaks protocol, she has a reason. She's not like the others. She doesn't work for praise. She works because she feels something we don't." He paused, then added, as if speaking more to himself than her, "I got chewed out for training her differently. But I believed in her, the same way I believed in you. Aspen wasn't made to follow. She was made to lead." Lydia glanced at Aspen, still sitting calmly at the edge of the clearing, watchful and still, like a small guardian of long-buried truths. In the flickering floodlights, she looked almost sculpted, a living monument to loyalty, endurance, and pure instinct. A creature that couldn't lie, wasn't swayed by ego or politics, and perhaps because of that, had become the one true light in a place where so many had chosen to look away. In the distance, Carter stood with a group of officers, still issuing low orders. But the confidence from that morning was gone. The mockery, the lectures about non-compliance had vanished. His eyes flicked toward Lydia now and then, no longer with superiority, but something closer to hesitation, even unease. Because what he once saw as her greatest weakness had just become the key to the most serious case his team had encountered in years. Lydia tightened the leash gently, feeling the warmth of Aspen's body pulsing through the fabric into her palm. Then she lifted her eyes and looked deep into the forest's darkened heart. She knew the journey was far from over, but at least now she wasn't walking it alone. And her guide didn't need maps, didn't need flashlights, just trust in a pair of upright ears, a nose that never lost its way, and a heart that never stopped listening to the things humans chose to forget. Darkness had fully settled over Rockwell Forest, and the scene lights cast shifting glows on damp tree trunks, creating flickering shadows that moved like spirits, drifting between life and buried memory. Lydia stood beside Aspen, still shaken from their earlier discovery. But she sensed something in the dog's posture, a silent tension that told her Aspen wasn't finished. There was more to be found. This wasn't restlessness or residual stress. It was the precise, trained alertness of scent detection, a skill honed from the very beginning, back when Aspen was still a stubborn trainee under Master Sergeant Calloway, the man who once said, "She never heads in a direction unless something's there." Lydia crouched down and whispered, barely audible, "Go ahead, girl. If there's more, show me." She loosened the leash. Aspen instantly lowered her body, nose to the earth, moving with slow, deliberate steps. As if reading a story written in scent, each root and fallen leaf a line of truth waiting to be uncovered. Within minutes, she stopped about 15 meters from the original site, beneath a twisted, dead tree that looked like a hand trying to hold on to something lost. Aspen sat, ears pricked, eyes locked on Lydia, as if she had just recovered a message left behind. Lydia moved closer, knelt beside her, and began peeling back the wet, matted leaves. A faint metallic glint appeared beneath the surface. A partially smoked cigarette, filter still intact, marked with a faint brick-red smear of lipstick. It wasn't just discarded trash. It was a fragment, something once held, once touched to someone's lips, now lying here like a silent witness. Carefully, Lydia sealed it in an evidence bag and logged the location. One possibility crossed her mind. Ryan hadn't been alone. He hadn't wandered off, slipped, or been lost in a sudden storm, as previous theories suggested. He had been with someone, maybe several people. Aspen wasn't done. That same look in her eyes pushed her further northeast, through a line of low trees, before she stopped again beneath a thick sim shrub. This time Lydia had to use her gloves to pull back the leaves and sodden soil. Buried beneath them was a crumpled handkerchief, stained with dark, dried blood at the corner. The smell, iron-rich and unmistakable, told Lydia immediately. Human blood. She sealed it in a forensic bag and called the crime scene techs for rapid analysis. The preliminary results came back that very night, quicker than expected given the weight of the case. Both the cigarette and the handkerchief contained Ryan Hollister's DNA. But more importantly, the cigarette also held the DNA of another unidentified individual, likely female. The lipstick analysis confirmed that the smoker had worn makeup. This detail shattered the earlier profile. Ryan wasn't alone. He had been with someone else, and they had left more than footprints behind. At the makeshift command center on the forest's edge, Detective Whitley stared at the growing map of the scene. Red pins stretched in an arc from the burial site, forming a path. A rough timeline. Ryan had been moved. He didn't die where he was buried. He had been in multiple locations. His blood had soaked into cloth. Someone had smoked a cigarette while watching, or participating in, whatever had happened. Whitley muttered to himself, his voice low, haunted. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated lie, and there may have been more than one person involved. Carter stood silently throughout, not questioning Lydia as he usually would. He watched as each piece of evidence was tagged. He watched Aspen, the dog he once dismissed as too reckless for the field, now standing in the forest like a silent witness, more precise than any report. He turned away, saying nothing, but Lydia caught a flicker in his expression, something breaking inside him. Perhaps it was the realization that his trust had been misplaced for far too long. In the hush of the forest, Aspen turned to Lydia, her gaze still full of something urgent and unspoken. She didn't want a reward. She didn't wait for praise. She only wanted the truth to be heard. And through every cigarette stub, every blood-stained scrap of cloth, every precise pause, Aspen was rewriting the entire narrative in a language no human had ever learned, the language of loyalty, of primal instinct, and the desperate will not to let anyone be forgotten. News of Ryan Hollister's body being discovered deep within Rockwell Forest didn't take long to escape the confines of the investigation. It spread quickly, seeping into the alert corners of local media. But out of all the names now circling the scene, one made Detective Whitley's jaw tighten the moment she stepped out of a dusty red Jeep: Chloe Rivera. An independent investigative journalist known for a scathing series on police corruption 3 years ago, Chloe was regarded by many in law enforcement as a persistent thorn, someone who poked around in places most wished would stay buried. She arrived with no pretense, hair tied back, camera bag slung over one shoulder, notebook frayed at the edges. But her eyes held the sharp focus of someone who had spent years chasing the truths others tried to bury. Whitley recognized her instantly and knew she already knew more than she should. Chloe didn't behave like a curious outsider. She moved slowly through the restricted area, eyes taking in every marker, every scanning device, and she paused a long time at the third location, where the bloodied handkerchief had been found. Whitley approached, ready to shut her down with protocol, but Chloe tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but razor-sharp. "Ryan's just one of many. You know that, don't you? Rockwell isn't the first, and it won't be the last." Lydia, nearby with Aspen, turned toward the voice, surprised and wary. Chloe noticed the look, walked over and softened her expression as her eyes fell on Aspen, resting near a tree, still watching the investigators like a sentinel on guard. Chloe crouched, hand extended not to touch, but in silent respect for the creature that had shifted the entire case. "Hello, girl," she whispered. "I've heard about what you did, and I think you just opened the door to something I've been chasing for 4 years." It was the way Chloe looked at Aspen, not like a tool, but a partner, that made Lydia let down her guard. "You said, 'many people,' what did you mean?" she asked. Chloe stood and pulled an old, weathered folder from her coat. Inside were scattered news clippings, missing persons reports, handwritten notes faded by time and water, all centered around unsolved disappearances over the past decade, all clustered around 3 national forests. Rockwell topped the list. "I started paying attention after Nathan Cole went missing 10 years ago," Chloe said, her voice low and steady. "A teenager vanished without a trace. Sound familiar? Then I found 2 more cases just like his. One was in the north section of Rockwell, and another was from just 2 years ago, a college student. Also vanished, no evidence. All the reports ended the same way. No signs of foul play. But the strange thing is, they all trace back to Rockwell." Whitley, who had looked irritated at first, now flipped through the folder without protest. Each page weighed heavier than the last. Names, timelines, disappearance zones. Lydia, with a ranger's sense of pattern and Aspen's instinct in her bones, began to understand. Aspen might have done something far bigger than uncovering a single crime. She had stirred a long dormant echo, one no one else had stayed still long enough to hear. But not everyone wanted those echoes to rise. From a distance, Sergeant Carter stood near the command vehicle, silently observing. He had heard the exchange, seen the glances between Whitley and Chloe. But what unsettled him wasn't the journalist. It was the fact that Lydia, the officer he had once dismissed as naive and undisciplined, was now the center of connection between the evidence, the witness, and the press. And deeper still was a rising fear. If Chloe was right, if Rockwell had more than one secret, then Carter, who had overseen training here for nearly a decade, couldn't claim ignorance. Because if he knew and did nothing, he had failed. But if he didn't know, then everything he thought he controlled, the structure, the order, the safety, had been a hollow illusion. When Chloe left after her short conversation, Lydia remained, eyes on the fading tree line. Aspen had risen now, facing a narrow, unexplored trail, and in Lydia's chest stirred a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not fear, not hope, but a quiet calling, rising from deep within the soil. This search was no longer just a case. It was a journey into collective memory, into the voices of those left behind, and only those patient enough, like Aspen, would hear the whisper, faint as breath, rising through the roots of the dark forest. As darkness swallowed Rockwell Forest, and the scene lights flickered like weary spirits dancing across tree trunks, Lydia thought the day had already exhausted every possible surprise, until Aspen moved again. After hours of stillness beside Ryan's body, the dog suddenly rose, nostrils flaring towards the southeast, where the terrain sloped gently among old pine roots and thick underbrush. Lydia tensed, hand tightening on the leash, eyes following Aspen as she pressed forward through dry leaves, her body drawn tight like a bow, eyes glowing faintly in the yellow light behind them. And without a command, she was off again. Whitley, just finishing a tense call with central data on archived GPS records from 4 months ago, caught only a glimpse of Lydia heading off trail. But he didn't stop her. He nodded to a tech officer and grabbed a flashlight. By now he understood. When Aspen changed direction, it was never random. 10 minutes later, in a damp clearing surrounded by ferns and fallen maple leaves, Aspen came to a halt. She didn't sit in her body alert position. This was different. Nose pressed to the ground, claws scratching softly. Then a pause. She turned and looked at Lydia with clear intent. Here. Lydia dropped beside her and started brushing away wet leaves and sticks. Her gloved fingers touched something hard, angular, wrapped in a scratched, cloudy plastic bag. She pulled it out carefully, peeled the bag open, and saw a smartphone. The outer shell was scratched, the screen cracked, but the inner casing was dry, untouched by moisture. It had been hidden, buried just under the forest floor. Not deeply, not carelessly lost, but purposefully stashed to avoid discovery. The tech team quickly set up a portable data kit in the clearing. Lydia, Whitley, and 2 other investigators gathered around the makeshift table as the laptop connected to the recovery device. No one spoke. They waited. Then the screen began to fill. Not with data logs, but photos. A slideshow of moments frozen in time, firelight dancing in the woods, laughter suspended in mid-air, young faces, and in the center, Ryan Hollister. Smiling brightly, seated among 3 other boys by the fire. His Westlake High jacket was still new. His eyes gleamed with innocence, with no idea of what would happen just hours later. Whitley stood still. He had read the original reports. All 3 of Ryan's friends claimed they'd canceled the trip. None of them had joined him. None knew where he went. But here they were, all 4 of them, in Rockwell Forest, drinking beer, laughing, and taking selfies by the fire. No tension, no signs of conflict. No one is missing. Lydia felt something colder than shock settle into her chest. It wasn't just what she saw. It was what she sensed. The smiles, the relaxed postures, they were masks. In the last few photos Ryan had pulled away from the center, his expression changed. In one blurry image taken from the side, Ryan stood apart from the group, arms crossed, staring into the dark woods beyond the fire, toward something, or someone, in the trees. A small detail, but unmistakable. Whitley nodded slowly, turning to the techs. Download everything. We need metadata, GPS, messages, call logs. If this phone wasn't wiped, then Ryan left something behind the killer never planned for. He glanced at Lydia, voice low but with a note of quiet respect. Her again, he said. meaning Aspen, who lay beside the table now, eyes half closed but ears still alert. Without her, that phone would still be buried in silence. Lydia leaned down and whispered into the dog's ear. No need for praise, just a truth shared in gratitude. Good girl. You just opened the door to everything. In the forest, wind rustled the canopy like a long-held breath finally exhaled. And behind those photos, images that seemed harmless, a death was starting to speak. Not with words, but with fragments drawn from darkness. And the first one to hear it was a dog. The photos from the phone shattered the lie that they had held for 4 long months. And when the name Tyler Westfield appeared in the photo tags, the entire investigative team stiffened. Not just because Tyler was one of the 3 teens in the campfire images, but because everyone knew the Westfields were not a typical family. Tyler's father, Cameron Westfield, was a man of immense influence in both business and local politics, a major donor, a power broker, a man who had quietly supported multiple election campaigns and had long-standing connections with the city police and nearby county departments. The kind of man who held meetings behind closed doors, not in front of microphones. The kind of man who could make a criminal case disappear with a few well-placed phone calls. Detective Whitley had seen men like Westfield before. Over his 2 decades in the force, he'd watched cases bend under invisible hands. A system outage that delayed a warrant. A clerk who mistakenly reclassified a file as low priority, a call from a friend of the department, urging a second look before things got messy. And now, as Ryan's phone quietly unveiled Tyler's presence during the fatal trip, Whitley felt the ground shift. Not loudly, but like damp earth pulling at your boots, slow and suffocating. As expected, just hours after the images were extracted and temporarily stored on an internal server, the district attorney's office received a sudden call from the Westfields' legal team. They demanded a freeze on information, citing protection of reputation and privacy of a citizen not formally charged. At the same time, a discreet memo arrived at the city police chief's desk, a thinly veiled warning that mishandling the matter could complicate future donations to community initiatives. Lydia heard the news while sitting at the edge of the woods with Aspen, jotting down field notes while letting the dog drink water. She wasn't surprised, but the familiar disgust returned. Not because of raw power, but because of how easily a name could crush justice under the weight of influence. Aspen, sensing her unease, nudged her shoulder gently, as if to say, "Don't let them push you back." Chloe Rivera, still at the scene gathering GPS signal maps, approached with a folder of old documents. "I investigated the Westfields once," she said, tone flat but eyes sharp. "Last year, Tyler was accused of assaulting another student at school. The case was handled internally. No punishment, no record, nothing." She handed Lydia an old article, pulled offline the morning after publication. One more piece in a puzzle built of silence, money, and control. Whitley decided to expand the investigation, but quietly instructed his junior team to keep details in-house. "They're going to spin this into an accident," he told Lydia as they reviewed the last batch of photos. "And if Ryan did try to leave that night, like the way he's standing suggests, then someone had a reason to stop him. The question is, how far did they go to keep him there?" Aspen lifted her head at that, ears perked, eyes locked on the unexplored stretch of woods. She seemed to understand. What they had uncovered so far was just the surface. Behind the power, behind the lies and those bright, easy smiles frozen in time, was something much darker, something only the brave would dare to pursue. And Lydia knew. If there was anyone she'd trust to guide her through that darkness, it was Aspen, a creature immune to politics, blind to power, loyal only to the truth, and driven by something no force could suppress: instinct, loyalty, and an unyielding love for the life that had been stolen. From the moment the photos on Ryan Hollister's phone appeared, clear, irrefutable, a hesitant silence swept over the investigation team stationed in the heart of Rockwell Forest. It was no longer speculation or a gut feeling. It was the truth, sharp and unforgiving, like a blade slicing through what fragile belief remained. Ryan hadn't gone hiking alone. There he was, a 17-year-old boy with a warm, carefree smile, seated around a campfire with Tyler Westfield, Ethan Drake, and Jason Morrow, 3 close friends, and the same 3 who had, for the last 4 months, repeated a single lie. We didn't go. Ryan went alone. When the missing person case was opened in early June, those consistent statements from the 3 teens led the police to believe it was simply a case of a young hiker who got lost. Tyler, who claimed to be Ryan's closest friend, had even teared up during a media interview. I should have gone with him. He just really wanted to be alone. Ethan said he had family obligations, and Jason claimed an emergency had kept him home. Not one of them admitted that they had camped with Ryan, in Rockwell, not Crestwood Park, as they'd sworn. Detective Whitley sat in the makeshift command tent, flipping through the original statements from June. Even back then, he'd felt something was off, a hunch, but with no proof, he'd been forced to close that line of inquiry. Now the photos Ryan had unknowingly left behind had become undeniable evidence of a coordinated lie. From the crackling campfire to the empty beer cans, from Ryan's fading presence in the last few shots to the way he edged out of frame, everything pointed to a very different reality, one that the 3 boys had tried to bury. Lydia sat quietly beside Aspen, her thoughts heavy. She thought of Ryan's parents, who had lived every day in anxious waiting, every night slumped on a couch praying their son was simply lost, not gone. And now, the truth wasn't just cruel. It was brutal. Their son wasn't lost by chance. He was abandoned, betrayed, and possibly killed by the very people who had called him their friend. Chloe Rivera, scribbling notes in her worn brown notebook, spoke softly to Lydia. Did you notice? In the last few photos, Ryan isn't smiling anymore. He's standing apart, arms crossed. He looks angry or scared. Lydia nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the shadowy tree line, a place the scene lights hadn't reached, but both her intuition and Aspen's senses said clearly, something still waited out there, unspoken. Whitley slammed his hand on the table, voice low and cold as steel. We're reopening the entire case. Their initial statements were lies. Everything related to Tyler, Ethan, and Jason. We recheck it all. Texts, phone tracking, traffic cams. I want every step retraced. His voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it was fierce. The fury of a man who had seen justice warped too often by power he couldn't stop. Just then, a forensic technician ran into the tent, holding a printout from the metadata embedded in the phone photos. Digital fingerprints often overlooked but impossible to fake. Sir, all the images have timestamps and GPS coordinates matching Rockwell Forest, not Crestwood. The last one was taken at 1:37 a.m. on June 6th. That's when the phone went dark. A chill slipped down Lydia's spine. She glanced at Aspen, the dog now lying still at her feet, yet fully alert, eyes glowing like coals, waiting for the next door to open. Lydia gently stroked her head and whispered, "We're close now, aren't we?" A few hundred meters away, near the parked command vehicles, Sergeant Carter stepped aside to take a phone call. No one heard the words, but the tightening of his jaw, the grip on the phone, the way his gaze drifted uneasily toward the forest. All said more than any statement could. He had once defended the training grounds as clean, off-limits, untouched. And now, that very place stood at the center of a murder tied to people he likely knew well. The first lie had cracked, and like a thin sheet of ice breaking beneath your feet, what lay underneath, cold, dark, dangerous, was about to surface. But Lydia wasn't backing down. Not with Aspen beside her, the only soul in this case who had never hidden a thing. And no matter how deep it was buried, the truth couldn't stay hidden forever from a nose sworn to seek it out. With the first lie exposed, the investigative team moved fast. They began a full reconstruction of the night Ryan disappeared, using photos, GPS coordinates, and physical traces to map every movement of the teens through the forest. Mobile floodlights lined the trail, Red string marked points of interest, tire imprints were flagged, and every site where Aspen had found evidence was pinned. The result was a living map, a timeline drawn into the earth, one that revealed a journey far too deliberate to be random. From time-stamped photos and digital positioning, it became clear the boys hadn't just camped on a whim. They had a plan. They entered the woods by car, chose a secluded area off the main trail, set up camp, stayed past midnight, and, notably, buried Ryan's phone nearly half a mile from where his body was found. These weren't spontaneous moves. This was someone deliberately erasing a trail. Detective Whitley stood at the center of the reconstructed scene, arms crossed, eyes scanning each marker with a mind sharpened by years of reading what others missed. He motioned to an officer, pointing toward a spot 30 meters from the camp, Aspen's first alert site. From here to where the body was buried is about 50 paces, but the boot prints only go one way. That means... The officer nodded, finishing the thought. Someone came back by a different route, probably to avoid leaving a trail. Both men knew. This level of care wasn't panic. It was planning. On the edge of the perimeter, Chloe Rivera watched from behind the tape. She wasn't allowed into the scene, but she didn't need to be. Years of investigative reporting had taught her how to read between the lines, and this case, with the Westfield name looming large, would never tell its full story in official reports. She held a long-range camera, capturing everything. The diagram layout, the tension on the team's faces, the way Carter's expression shifted when he thought no one was watching. Each photo was a puzzle piece, not for a story, but for exposing a system that had looked away too many times. But just as Chloe positioned herself on a high rock for a full view of the burial site, a sharp voice barked behind her. "What are you doing here?" A perimeter officer had spotted her movement. Chloe responded quickly, slipping the camera behind her, face calm. "Just taking notes. I haven't crossed the line." Her voice was soft, but her mind was already planning a retreat. Before the situation could escalate, Lydia appeared, having noticed Chloe earlier. She stepped forward and spoke with quiet authority. "She's an investigative reporter. She's worked with us since the start. Better to keep her here than have the whole media camped outside." The officer didn't look convinced, but said nothing more. Chloe gave Lydia a small nod of gratitude, then leaned closer and whispered, "I'm documenting what might get erased. We need to preserve it before someone tries to clean it up." A short distance away, Aspen lifted her head, eyes sharp as ever. She didn't bark, didn't move, just watched, alert, constant, a silent sentinel of truth. She lay like a shadow cast by the facts themselves, listening, guarding, ready to move again when needed. Beneath the dim lights, the forest seemed to murmur secrets it had kept for years. But this time, Lydia, Aspen, Whitley, and even Chloe, 4 people from different worlds but united in purpose, were ready to listen. Even as unseen forces tried to distort, delay, or erase the truth, here in Rockwell, the tracks left behind weren't fading, because one dog was still following them step by step. The days that followed the crime scene reenactment were quiet but tense, as each missing piece of the Ryan Hollister case slowly came into view, as if the entire Rockwell forest were waking from a decade-long sleep. And then, just as the investigative team was combing through old testimonies, someone who had long faded from the spotlight unexpectedly emerged as a key witness. Ranger Caleb Sullivan, a man who had spent nearly his entire life tending to Rockwell, who had once witnessed the lingering grief of Nathan Cole's family, and who had always sensed that this forest held more than any map had ever revealed. When Sullivan arrived at the makeshift command tent, his boots were caked with mud, and his faded uniform carried the scent of pine resin. It felt like he had stepped straight out of the forest itself. He needed no guide, no invitation. He simply knew it was time to speak of what he had kept inside for too long. Whitley, familiar with Sullivan's stern and private nature, immediately cleared a time for a closed-door meeting in the main tent, with only Lydia, a transcription assistant, and Aspen, the dog, curled silently by the entrance, watching the ranger with a gaze that said she recognized something vital had just returned to the story. Sullivan began in his usual raspy tone. I remember that morning, June 6th, clear as day. I had just checked a trap line near the West Creek when I saw smoke from a campfire that hadn't been properly put out. When I got there, I saw 3 boys. They didn't look like they were resting. No tent was set up, and sleeping bags were still packed. But the food scraps, beer cans, and the campfire all said they'd spent the night. He paused, gathering the memory more clearly before going on. What set me on edge was their behavior. Their eyes were nervous, their answers evasive, and especially Tyler. He was standing right in front of a red Jeep, clearly trying to block the license plate. He wasn't polite like most teens I meet out there. Whitley sat still, fingers laced on the table, eyes locked on the Rangers. Lydia's voice was calm but firm as she asked, "Do you recall anything unusual? Anyone else? Anything left behind?" Sullivan nodded slowly, like brushing off the dust that time had laid over his memory. "There was one thing I haven't been able to shake. I saw blood, just a small streak, hastily wiped, on a scrap of cloth thrown near the base of a tree. When I asked about it, they said someone slipped gathering firewood. But I've been a ranger for 30 years. I know human blood when I see it." The light inside the tent flickered as wind howled outside, but the silence inside was absolute. That one phrase, human blood, wasn't just evidence, it was a turning point. A quiet confirmation that something awful had indeed happened the night of that camping trip. Then, Sullivan added something that made both Lydia and Whitley glance sharply at each other. When I said I'd report this to the forest department, Tyler changed. He wasn't scared anymore. He turned cold, calm, like someone flipping a switch. He said, "I think we should leave. My dad's got a meeting at City Hall this morning." Suddenly, what had long been suspicion now took form. Tyler knew how to protect himself, not with reason, but with power. Power inherited from his father, Cameron Westfield. From that moment on, Sullivan understood. If he filed a report, no one would believe him. No evidence, no body, just instinct. And Westfield had what Sullivan never would: money, influence, and the means to silence anything inconvenient. Chloe Rivera, who had been recording from the back, quietly nodded to Lydia. In her eyes was a spark, the kind that appears when a journalist finds the pulse of a story thought long dead. She whispered, "If this statement holds, it won't just expose the boy's lie. It'll show who planned the escape from the very start." Outside the tent, Aspen stirred. Her ears perked. She didn't bark or whine, but her sharp, unwavering gaze made Lydia rise without a word. She knew something was waiting to be found. Like Sullivan, she couldn't stay silent anymore. Not when the truth was this close, and not when a dog was already walking into the dark, chasing a final light for a boy who once believed in friendship. By the time the investigation team's internal meeting ended, night had fallen. Rain had begun to descend quietly on Rockwell Forest, like a mourning veil covering secrets finally brought to light. Lydia and Aspen had just returned from the Northern Trail, where officers were retracing the route the boys once took, when the crackle of the radio pierced the air. Through static and rain, the voice from the county holding station came sharp and urgent. "Subject Ethan Drake, suspect in the Ryan Hollister case, has escaped custody. Last seen running westward, wearing a dark jacket, possibly still in the vicinity of Rockwell. All teams deploy immediately." The command tent froze for a moment. Whitley looked up from his data logs, stunned. Lydia didn't ask questions. She simply tapped Aspen's back, the companion who always seemed to sense what no one else could. They were off at once, plunging into the thickening rain, heading toward the path where Ethan was believed to have fled. The forest at night under rain was nothing like by day, sounds muffled, trails erased by water. But Aspen didn't hesitate. Her ears stood tall, nose sweeping the wet earth like she was following a scent etched in memory, not mud. At a fork between low maple bushes, she veered left and suddenly picked up speed. Lydia didn't need confirmation. Aspen had found the trail. They crossed 3 ridges, navigated a slick ravine thick with moss, and emerged into a clearing, an abandoned logging site. There, Lydia spotted shallow skid marks in the mud, footprints matching Ethan's file. He had been there, recently. Aspen became more animated, darting through the underbrush, tail stiff, a sure sign the target was close. A crunch of movement ahead made Lydia snap to attention. A shadow, brief, then gone into the woods. She shouted over the storm, "Ethan, stop! I don't want to use force!" But the figure kept running, down toward a ravine. Dangerous terrain, slick and treacherous. Aspen bolted forward, passing Lydia like a dark arrow in the white rain. At the edge, she stopped, letting out a sharp, warning bark. Ethan, mid-jump over a fallen tree, froze. For the first time in his life, he saw a dog that didn't bark, didn't attack, just stood there, guarding the line between truth and the abyss. Aspen's gaze held no hate, no fear, just certainty, and it shattered him. Ethan collapsed into the mud, shaking under the downpour, clutching his head, whispering the words no one expected. "I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't mean to." When Lydia reached him, breath ragged from the climb, she said nothing. She calmly cuffed him. Under the flickering beam of her flashlight, the boy before her was no longer the proud figure he had once pretended to be. Just a teenager, crushed by fear, broken not by the law, but by the unwavering presence of a dog. Lydia knelt and gently rested her hand on Aspen's head, her eyes soft despite the exhaustion. "You found him not just with your nose, with your heart." That night, Ethan was returned to custody, and in a special interrogation that lasted until dawn, he finally spoke. No more lies, no more excuses. He told of Ryan's death, the brief, fateful fight, and how Tyler had convinced him to hide the body and stage the disappearance as a solo hiking accident. Everything was recorded, but the first force to break the silence wasn't the law. It was a dog, a quiet keeper of justice, led by loyalty, not judgment. And Lydia knew, though the road ahead was long, that night they had reclaimed a piece of Ryan's soul, not with weapons, but with patience, and a love that never ran dry. The air inside the investigation center was still as thick as the early morning mist that clung to Rockwell Forest, even as faint sunlight began to filter through the leaves. The overnight manhunt for Ethan Drake, along with his fragmented confession between gasps of breath in the rain-soaked woods, had been the final drop to overflow the truth. But just as the team was focused on validating Ethan's statement, something unexpected happened. Jason Morrow, the quietest, most fragile of the 3 suspects, suddenly requested a private meeting with investigators. His eyes were red, voice was trembling as if a storm was raging inside his thin, shaking frame. Jason was brought into the interrogation room, uncuffed, without a lawyer. He had refused both. He didn't sit. He stood silently by the window, staring at the dim light falling across the tiled floor, as if searching for a place to hide. Then, slowly, like a child confessing to a long-dead mother, he turned and whispered in a voice almost unrecognizable, "I can't take it anymore. I've been silent too long. I let him die out there. I chose fear, and I chose wrong." Detective Whitley simply nodded, saying nothing. He signaled the clerk to pause the recording. Sometimes the truth needs complete silence to be heard. Jason began to speak. Not prompted, not guided, just an unfiltered stream of memory, finally breaking loose like floodwaters from a cracked dam. That night, the group, Ryan, Tyler, Ethan, and Jason, had brought beer, camping gear, firewood, and the kind of reckless excitement that comes with escaping the adult world. They never went to Crestwood, as they'd claimed. Instead, they chose Rockwell because it was remote, unmonitored, and off-grid. No cameras, no cell service, no rules. What they didn't realize was how quickly darkness inside a person grows when no one is watching. Jason said it began with Tyler. Drunk and spiraling, confronting Ryan over messages between Ryan and Tyler's ex-girlfriend, a girl he still had feelings. Ryan brushed it off, annoyed, insisting it was long over. But Tyler wouldn't let it go. His temper, sharpened by privilege and never having lost, flared. Words escalated. Ethan stepped in, trying to calm things down, but eventually lost patience too. Ryan, feeling ganged up on, stood up, started packing, and threatened to leave. I remember him saying, "I'm not staying where I'm doubted and disrespected." Then it happened. In a flash of anger, Tyler shoved Ryan from behind. It wasn't a punch, just an impulsive push. But Ryan stumbled, tripped over a root, and fell backward, his skull striking a large rock by the fire. The sound, the dull, hollow crack of bone against stone, is what Jason says he hears every night in his dreams. Silence followed. Ethan screamed and ran over, but Ryan didn't move. His breathing slowed, then stopped. Panic set in. Tyler spoke first. "We're screwed. No one will believe this was an accident. We were drunk. We argued. They'll think we killed him." He was the one who suggested burying the body. Jason wanted to say no, but he couldn't. He helped dig, his hands shaking. Ethan cleaned the blood. Tyler took Ryan's phone, removed the SIM card, and hid it beneath a stone, where Aspen would later find it. "I knew it was wrong," Jason sobbed, his shoulders trembling, "but I was terrified. Not of jail, of losing my friends, of being left behind, of becoming the next one pushed." Tears streamed down his face, not the kind you expect from scared teenagers, but the kind that pass judgment on yourself. No jury needed, no prosecutor, just guilt. Behind the one-way mirror, Lydia watched in silence, each word of the confession cutting deep. At her feet, Aspen lay still, her eyes fixed on Jason. Not as if he were guilty, but as if she understood the pain he hadn't dared to name. Lydia bent down, gently stroking Aspen's head, and whispered, "You brought us here, didn't you?" No bark, no movement, just that heavy stillness, the kind that comes from knowing the truth all along and patiently following it. Jason's statement became the final key that linked all the scattered evidence. Photos from the phone, the items Aspen found, the ranger's testimony, Ethan's admission. The case was no longer a fog of contradictions. It was now a tragic story about fear, jealousy, and the devastating cost of silence. And Lydia knew, without Aspen's eyes, her nose, her unwavering loyalty, Ryan might have remained just a name on a cold case file. But now, through pain, at least he was found, led back home by the tireless steps of a friend he never met, who chose to stay. Jason's tearful confession not only revealed the truth about Ryan Hollister's death, it also exposed a calculated, deliberate plan, carefully constructed after that fateful night. A web of deception orchestrated by Tyler Westfield, who had taken charge, wiping every trace, crafting a narrative so convincing it fooled even the investigation team. As Jason's sobs faded into silence, he continued, voice hoarse, each word scraping its way out, as he recounted what followed the fall. In the dim campfire glow, with Ryan's body lying still, the three boys were no longer friends. They were survivors, stranded at the edge of a terrible mistake. But it was Tyler, eerily composed, who broke the paralysis. Not with remorse, but with cold calculation. His eyes were already turning the moment into a plan. "We're not letting this ruin our lives. No one knows we're here. No one ever will." Tyler was the first to mention Crestwood Park, a site nearly 20 miles from Rockwell, the place they had claimed to be headed. He outlined everything. The next morning, they'd take Ryan's belongings, his backpack, jacket, and even his phone with the SIM card removed, and stage a false scene in Crestwood. They'd park his car at a public lot, place his items near a trail, and create the illusion that Ryan disappeared while hiking alone. "The cops will believe it. The media will believe it. They'll search the wrong place. We'll have time to forget." Jason remembered every word. Ethan, still in shock, nodded without thinking. Jason, trembling, was caught between the body of a friend he once trusted and the overwhelming pressure from Tyler, a figure he had admired and feared in equal measure. When Jason weakly objected to burying Ryan right there in the forest, Tyler turned on him with a glare of steel. "You want us all in prison? You were there too. Don't think you're innocent." Jason was forced to dig. He laid down branches, covered Ryan with dirt and leaves after Tyler and Ethan placed him in the grave. It wasn't just physical labor. It was a betrayal he could never undo. He didn't cry then, but he vomited in silence when Tyler said, "It's done." The next morning, under the soft forest sun, the three boys drove away from Rockwell in Tyler's Jeep, saying nothing. They left behind a hidden death, buried by young hands, fueled by fear and a selfishness fed by years of being allowed to get away with everything. That afternoon, as planned, they drove to Crestwood Park and staged the scene. They placed Ryan's backpack near a trail, carefully arranged his gear like it had been forgotten, stashed the powered-off phone in the outer pocket, and parked his car in the public lot. Every detail aligned with a believable solo hiking disappearance. Then they returned to the city, each crafting their alibi, and reported Ryan missing the next day, claiming they'd just heard from his family. Jason recounted it all in a voice stripped of pretense. He said he had wanted to speak up many times, but each time he saw Tyler on television, mourning his lost best friend, it felt like a noose tightening around his throat. He had been the last to stay silent. Now he was the one to open the final door to the truth. Whitley sat in silence for a long time afterward. He knew now. This wasn't just an accident or an impulsive mistake. It was the concealment of a body, a staged crime scene, a deliberate misdirection of justice. It was organized, intentional, and led by one person, Tyler Westfield. Outside the interrogation room, Lydia clutched Aspen's leash instinctively. She didn't cry, but her chest ached with the thought of Ryan, a boy once smiling in photographs, tricked, shoved, buried, and nearly forgotten. Then she looked at Aspen, the one who had pulled every truth from the cold earth, with her nose, her instinct, and a heart that never wavered. "We're doing the right thing," Lydia whispered, not to herself, but to her four-legged partner. Aspen tilted her head slightly, eyes scanning the woods as if sensing something was still unfinished. And Lydia knew. It wasn't over. Tyler had said nothing, and the darkness behind his polished facade might go deeper than anyone had dared imagine. The moment Jason's confession was transcribed and officially added to the case file, the atmosphere at the investigation center felt like it was on the edge of release, as if they were finally nearing the end. But Lydia knew, and Whitley knew too. This was only halfway there, because the real figure pulling strings behind this tragedy wasn't a teenager. It was a man who had never once stepped foot on the scene, yet whose influence was constant. Cameron Westfield, Tyler's father. Throughout the investigation, Cameron's name had lingered quietly in the background. No statements, no press appearances, no public defense of his son like most fathers might offer. But it was precisely that silence that made him dangerous. He didn't need to speak. His wealth, connections, and reach spoke for him. And then, hidden deep within financial records Whitley had ordered traced back to June, the month Ryan vanished, a thorn of a detail appeared. A $75,000 cash withdrawal from Cameron's account, sent directly to one David Lantry, a seasonal forestry worker who'd been employed in Rockwell at the time of the incident. David Lantry, whose name had only briefly been mentioned by Ranger Caleb Sullivan as someone hired to help clear trails, who quit suddenly, was now a crucial piece of the puzzle. Chloe Rivera, relentless in her pursuit of truth, was the first to track him down. In a quiet corner of Jefferson County's outskirts, where David had been lying low, she managed to record their conversation. On tape, his voice shaken, he admitted that a man named Westfield had approached him and offered money in exchange for silence on what he had seen in the forest that night. Enough money to disappear. Though David hesitated, the recording captured more clarity than any sworn statement thus far. "I don't know how the boy died, but I saw them. I saw the red Jeep. I saw that blonde kid, Tyler, dragging something wrapped in tarp out of the woods. I didn't even have time to react before Mr. Westfield called me over. He gave me the money, told me to keep my mouth shut. That same afternoon, Chloe didn't wait. She walked straight into a specially arranged press briefing held by the police. As reporters scrambled to ask about Tyler's condition, Chloe stood, not shouting, not jostling, but calmly placed a small recorder on the table and pressed play. The room fell into stunned silence as David Lantry's confession rang out. Every word was like a blade, cutting through the shield of influence. I saw them. I saw the boy. I saw the tarp. Mr. Westfield gave me money, told me not to speak. Murmurs rippled through the room like a rising tide. Within seconds, Cameron Westfield's lawyer, a composed man in a slate-gray suit who had previously brushed off all accusations, stood and objected, claiming the recording was illegally obtained and inadmissible. But Chloe didn't flinch. She met his gaze and replied, voice steady and sharp. I recorded it with the witness's consent, using 2 independent devices in a public place. And if you'd like, I can release the transfer documents this afternoon. The room fell silent again. Not from shock. This time, it was resignation. The truth had finally stepped into the center, impossible to deny or dodge. Lydia, watching from the command vehicle, leaned her head gently against the window. Aspen rested quietly in the passenger seat, eyes as calm as ever. As dusk poured through the trees of Rockwell, Lydia whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "Their last shield is cracking now, isn't it?" And it was true. For the first time in months, the truth was no longer buried, no longer smothered by wealth. It had risen, pulled into the light by a fearless journalist, a forgotten witness, and most of all, a chain of brave decisions made by people who refused to stay quiet. Tyler was no longer just a privileged boy with a powerful father. He was now part of a planned cover-up, and the legal noose was tightening. Not in the shadows, but in full daylight. After the bombshell press conference where Chloe Rivera played David Lantry's damning recording, the Ryan Hollister case shifted into a new phase. Not whispers in the woods or vague denials, but a full-scale legal battle. One where justice and power would have to confront each other under the scrutiny of the law and the grieving silence of a family that had lost their only son. That morning, in Rockford County Court, the first hearing opened under a pressurized silence. On one side sat the Hollister family, exhausted but firm. On the other, the Westfields, dignified, prideful, flanked by a high-profile attorney who entered the courtroom not to hear the truth, but to reframe it. Lydia stood in the courthouse hallway, not as part of the official investigation team, but as a quiet witness. Aspen sat beside her, dark coat stark against the cold white marble. No one paid attention to the dog, but Lydia knew. Without her, this day wouldn't exist. The prosecution, armed with Jason's testimony, Chloe's recording, and every physical trace the forensics team had pulled from Rockwell, made its move. Tyler Westfield and Ethan Drake would be charged with second-degree manslaughter, concealment of a body, and staging a false crime scene. Jason Morrow, for cooperating fully, would face accessory charges with a suspended sentence. Public opinion split immediately. But inside the courtroom, the Hollisters didn't celebrate. They didn't cry. They knew, justice or not, their son would never come back. Cameron Westfield sat behind his lawyer, composed as always. But Lydia, watching from the hallway, saw the tightness in his jaw, the way he never once looked at the victim's family. Power does that. It remains cold until it must face something undeniable. And when forced to sit still, unable to interfere, it becomes dangerous in new ways. At the podium, the lead prosecutor spoke plainly. No theatrics, only precision. We're not here to debate the morality of boys who hadn't grown up yet. We're here to hold them accountable for a chain of choices that ended a life and buried it in silence. The courtroom hushed. No accident is hidden this carefully. No moment of panic leaves behind a fabricated scene and a misdirected investigation planned to the last detail. Tyler's lawyer rose, offering the usual defenses. Mental stress, teenage impulsiveness, lack of adult guidance. Chloe, from the back row, shook her head. Lydia, silently clutching Aspen's leash, didn't move. They had seen what adult guidance really looked like. A father's hand not leading his son away from wrongdoing, but burying the evidence of it. Then came the Hollisters' moment to speak. Elizabeth, Ryan's mother, stepped forward, holding her son's photo. No makeup, no theatrics. Her voice was even but piercing. "We're not here to demand revenge. We just want to understand why our son's death was treated like something shameful. Ryan wasn't a mistake. He was kind. And maybe, if someone had told the truth sooner, our son wouldn't have spent 4 months buried in the forest. He deserved to come home, not to be found by a dog?" Her voice cracked. She turned to Lydia, who, by then, couldn't hold back her tears, and finished, "We're grateful for the team, and especially for Aspen." Silence filled the room. No applause, no reaction, just quiet reverence. As everyone turned to look at the dog in the hallway, her deep brown eyes betraying no judgment, only loyalty. Lydia bowed her head slightly, whispering to Aspen what everyone now felt but couldn't say aloud. "You brought justice back to us in a way no one else ever could." And with that, the hearing closed. But the ripple it created was stronger than any verdict. For the first time, the most powerful family in town had to face the truth. And the smallest figures in the story, those with no titles, no money, and nothing but persistence, had become the ones who uncovered it. After the hearing ended and the media swarmed around testimonies, court dates, and the future of Tyler and Ethan, Lydia stepped away from the chaos. She led Aspen back to the small outpost on the edge of town. Quieter, simpler, and the place where it all began. Under the golden canopy of autumn trees, Aspen lay stretched across the grass, eyes half closed as if she was finally allowing herself to rest after days of unrelenting tension. Lydia sat beside her, watching the rise and fall of her breath. And then, the memory returned of the first day they met, on a pale, sunny morning at an old military training ground, where Aspen had nearly been erased from the world she was born to serve. 3 years ago, Aspen was still part of a special U.S. Marine Corps training program for elite K-9s, selected for search and rescue, bomb detection, and body recovery in war zones. Among dozens of rigorously chosen dogs, Aspen stood out, not just for her sharp instincts and agile frame, but for her scent-tracking ability that surpassed standard thresholds. But it was that very gift that became her problem. During many assessments, Aspen repeatedly broke protocol, refusing to stay or halt when commanded, instead following scent trails she was convinced were right. Most instructors labeled it disobedience. Only one man saw something else, Master Sergeant Reed Calloway, a former battlefield forensic investigator. He spent hours watching Aspen from a distance, noting the way she picked paths others missed, how she locked onto the faintest traces that the other dogs ignored. And during the final evaluation, when Aspen was struck from the list, Calloway finally spoke up. "This dog isn't wrong," he told the board. "She just needs someone who'll listen. But the military doesn't make space for those who are too independent." Aspen was officially removed from the program a week later, reassigned to civilian law enforcement, a system where most non-compliant dogs rarely reached their potential. And it was Calloway, who had seen that rare, searching gaze, who personally recommended Aspen to Lydia, who had just graduated from a forensic investigation course and was looking for a K-9 partner to start her civilian career. When they first met, Aspen didn't charge over, didn't wag her tail, or lick Lydia's hand. She just sat quietly, staring at her, like waiting for a question she already knew the answer to. Lydia never forgot that moment. Those deep, steady eyes weren't asking for training. They were asking if she was someone worth walking beside. Calloway, standing off to the side with his arms crossed, simply smiled. "She doesn't need commands," he said. "She needs a reason. And if you're patient enough to give her one, you'll never be alone again." That afternoon, Lydia brought Aspen home. No leash, no commands, just two quiet souls stepping through a gate, beginning a bond that needed no vows. Since then, Aspen became more than a K9. She was a compass when Lydia lost her way at crime scenes, the quiet ears when logic hit a wall, the unwavering instinct that never flinched in the face of buried truths or human lies. She wasn't just a cadaver dog. She was the silent witness to pain no one spoke of, to cries no one heard, to lives that hadn't yet been found. Now, with the sun fading behind the pine ridge, Lydia stroked Aspen's head, feeling the steady breath beneath her fur. She knew, if Calloway hadn't seen something rare in a dog deemed too willful, and if Lydia herself hadn't trusted instinct over instruction, Ryan might still be out there, lost forever. And in that soft silence of evening, wrapped in Rockwell's whispering wind, Lydia smiled faintly and murmured, almost for both of them, "Thank you for not following orders. And thank you for never giving up." Aspen didn't respond. She simply rested her head against Lydia's leg. A simple gesture, but the truest answer she could give. That same evening, just as Lydia and Aspen returned from their quiet moment of reflection, revisiting the thread that had bound them from the start, a call from dispatch shattered the calm. Ranger Caleb Sullivan had discovered an unfamiliar plot of land deep within Rockwell. It wasn't on any forestry maps, hadn't been part of patrol zones or logging routes, but something about it felt disturbingly familiar, and he immediately called it in, requesting only one team, Lydia and Aspen. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a place he had avoided for 10 years, a place he had wandered into once, disoriented, and where he believed, just for a moment, he had heard a child crying, but no trace was ever found. Lydia didn't hesitate. She set out with Aspen and 2 forensic officers that same afternoon, trekking through moss-slick stone paths and into terrain deeper than she'd ever gone in Rockwell. The forest breathed around them, damp, dense, whispering with rustling leaves like the past reaching out to be heard. Aspen moved ahead, not rushing, but precise. Her nose stayed low to the ground, her body taut with that same focus that had brought so many home. Lydia followed, heart heavy with something that felt like a premonition. This wasn't just about one name anymore. They reached the spot, a small clearing surrounded by brittle pines and buried under roots and gray mountain stone. Aspen stopped. She didn't bark. She simply circled one patch of ground, then began to dig. Not frantically, but with a steady, determined rhythm, as if she already knew what was waiting beneath. The forensic team moved in quickly. In under 30 minutes, a portion of a human body emerged from the dark, wet soil. Nearby, a faded leather collar was uncovered, etched with a name, Nathan Cole. The sound of it, spoken aloud, hit like thunder through the still woods. Nathan, the 14-year-old boy who had gone missing 10 years ago. The boy Sullivan had searched for, begged others to keep looking for, only to be dismissed as a sad anomaly. Lost to nature, the report had said. But now, with that collar, with that body, with Aspen's unwavering nose, the truth was undeniable. Nathan hadn't gone missing. He had been buried, forgotten, and someone had wanted it to stay that way. They found more nearby. 2 small metallic objects wrapped in oiled cloth, an old military badge and a strip of school uniform fabric, which opened a new and horrifying possibility. This wasn't an isolated case. When Lydia reported back, the command center immediately cross-referenced the discovery with other unsolved disappearances around Rockwell over the past 15 years. The pattern was chilling. 3 other missing teens, all with vanished trails, closed cases, and all within areas that once hosted military training operations. As they walked back toward the command vehicle, Lydia's steps felt heavier, not only because of what they'd found, but because she knew Aspen wouldn't stop. She never had. Not once. If today they'd found Nathan, tomorrow could bring another. And after that, maybe all the names buried in silence, waiting to be uncovered. At the base, under dim light, Caleb Sullivan met them. When Lydia held out the leather collar, he didn't speak. He just removed his ranger's hat and clutched it to his chest, like holding a piece of the boy he had never managed to save. Beside him, Aspen stood still, caked in mud, exhausted, yet her eyes were open, lifted to the sky, listening for something no one else could hear. A whisper, a grievance, or maybe just the wind carrying the memory of what was lost. And Lydia knew, even if the trial ended, even if Tyler and Ethan faced their sentences, the true battle had only just begun. Because Rockwell hadn't told all of its story yet, but thankfully they still had Aspen, the one who followed no orders, only the truth. And this time, the truth was waiting. One handful of dirt at a time, one forgotten soul at a time, until no one was left buried in silence. News of the discovery of Nathan Cole's body, hidden in Rockwell Forest for over a decade, spread quickly through the community, sparking a new wave of investigations and reopening forgotten missing persons cases. But amid the legal storm and the growing horror over what had long been buried, a quiet, deeply moving moment took place. Not in a courtroom, but in the very forest where Ryan Hollister had been found, thanks to Aspen. That afternoon, while Lydia and the forensics team were still combing the area near where Nathan's remains had surfaced, the Hollister family, James and Elizabeth, arrived. They carried a bundle of wildflowers and an old photo frame they'd held onto throughout the long months of searching for their son. They didn't ask for directions. They remembered the trail clearly, the path that led to the place where Aspen had unearthed the first truth. When Lydia saw them from a distance, thin figures standing tall in the slanting afternoon light, she knew this wasn't just a visit. It was the final step in a journey, a quiet closing of grief, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Elizabeth approached Aspen, who lay resting beside Lydia after a long day of scent tracking. Beneath the dirt and dry leaves caught in her dark fur, Aspen's eyes were still clear, still calm, as if guarding something sacred. Elizabeth didn't speak at first. She knelt, gently placed her hand on Aspen's head, and pulled from her pocket a small handkerchief embroidered with the name Ryan, the one her son always brought to summer camp. She laid it by Aspen's paws, a belated farewell, a gift for the friend who had never left her boy's side, even without ever knowing him. "I used to fear that my son died alone," Elizabeth said, her voice held up by the weight of years unspoken. "I imagined his last moments, cold, afraid, with no one there. But when I found out Aspen stayed with him, didn't leave, didn't turn away, I understood one thing. Ryan wasn't alone." James stood beside his wife, quiet, his eyes wet as he looked at Aspen. Not as a dog, but as a silent companion, the one who had stood by his child when he couldn't. Lydia couldn't speak. Her chest ached with the weight of that gratitude, raw and heavy. In all her years, she had never heard a thank you that carried so much. There were no cameras, no reporters, no applause, only the whisper of wind through old pines, the flap of a late bird's wings, and the soft tread of footsteps in the forest that had become sacred. The Hollisters planted their wildflowers at a stone outcrop near where Ryan had been found, beside a small wooden plaque they had brought with them, hand-carved with the words, "Where truth rose and love never left." Before they left, Elizabeth turned once more, stroking Aspen's head, not as a grieving mother, but as someone who had found peace. "Thank you," she whispered, "for leading us to him." Then she walked away, hand in her husband's, like they were finally being led out of a long, dark dream. Lydia watched them go, then turned to Aspen, brushing the fur along her neck where her collar had rubbed that morning. She smiled softly. "You didn't just find the truth," she said, voice thick with emotion. "You brought Ryan home, in a way none of us could." As always, you didn't need to reply. She simply leaned her head against Lydia's hand and exhaled, eyes closing in a peace unlike any she had known before. Because that day, not just a child was returned, but a family was given back a piece of their heart they thought they'd lost forever. As the final light of late autumn faded over the modest memorial in Rockwell Forest, where the Hollister family had left their words of thanks, Lydia sat beside Aspen, feeling her thoughts settle like a still lake after the wind. She believed nothing could ever truly honor what Aspen had done. But she was wrong. 3 days later, to the cheers of a grateful community, a small but formal ceremony was held at the state capitol. Aspen was honored in front of the entire police force, the forensics team, and hundreds of residents, as a living symbol of loyalty, courage, and truth. The ceremony took place under the soft winter sun in the city's central square, once an old train station, now transformed into a tribute site for those who serve justice. Aspen stepped onto the stage beside Lydia, her coat brushed smooth, a deep red sash around her neck embroidered with the state seal and the K9 insignia. When the governor personally knelt to place a special medal around Aspen's neck, the Silent Star, awarded to those who never speak yet make the world listen, the crowd rose to its feet in thunderous applause. The next morning, headlines across the state read, "Aspen, the K9 who broke 4 months of silence." In a short but heartfelt speech, the state representative made it clear, "We're not just honoring a working dog. We're honoring a soul who refused to turn away from wrong, who followed what was right, even when it meant going against orders. Aspen didn't break rules. She reminded us that some rules must be broken for justice to be heard." Lydia stood beside Aspen throughout the speech, her hand resting gently on her back. She didn't say a word, but in her heart she saw Ryan's face in that tiny photograph by his grave. She heard Aspen's first bark as she uncovered the disturbed earth. She remembered that moment, when one woman and one dog bent down together and pulled the truth from the dark. After the ceremony, a group of schoolchildren gave Aspen a gift, a collar with a tiny silver bell, a symbol, they said, of the bell that wakes up our conscience. Aspen didn't understand the ceremony, but she understood emotion. She accepted the gift, bowed her head politely, and returned to Lydia's side, the only place she had ever needed to be. That night, the evening news didn't open with politics or economics. It opened with footage of Aspen walking between 2 rows of officers standing at attention, beneath a headline that read, "Not all heroes carry weapons. Some carry hearts, noses, and unshakable will." For Lydia, the greatest reward wasn't the medal. It was knowing justice had been named, because of a soul that never needed words to be heard. That night, Aspen curled at the foot of Lydia's bed like she always did. She didn't know what glory was. She didn't care for recognition. What mattered most to her was trust, and she had earned it 100 times over. Lydia looked at her and whispered, "You deserve everything, but you never had to prove it, because you already saved us, not just with your skills, but with your refusal to give up." To Lydia and a whole community, Aspen would never just be the dog who cracked the case. She would be a symbol of silent faith, the kind that can lead a lost world back to truth. After the applause of the award ceremony faded and headlines gave way to newer events, Lydia quietly stepped away from the spotlight. She returned to the only place that truly mattered, the place where everything had begun, and where, ultimately, everything had ended in truth. That afternoon, she and Aspen walked once more through the familiar paths of Rockwell Forest, past the thin, weathered trees that stood like old witnesses, returning to the clearing where Ryan had been found, the place where Aspen had first disobeyed a direct order to follow something beyond training, something deeper, something spiritual, a soul. The sky that day was strangely clear, and the sunset poured through the treetops, painting the ground with streaks of pale gold, like someone had tried to repaint a memory in watercolor. Lydia sat on the old stone near where Ryan had once been buried, a space now preserved by the community as a quiet memorial. Beside it stood the wooden sign, its words gently worn by wind and time. Here, justice was found, thanks to a heart that never stopped listening. Aspen lay beside her, resting her head softly on Lydia's thigh, her eyes drifting toward the horizon, as if rereading a story no one else could see. Lydia gently stroked her head, her fingers brushing the forest-scented fur and whispered, not expecting an answer, just needing to say it. "You knew from the start, didn't you? You broke the rules because you felt something I couldn't." Her voice carried no doubt, only reverence. Some instincts can't be explained, but they are never wrong. Aspen didn't move, didn't react, just closed her eyes, as if in quiet agreement, perhaps even remembering the moment when she had turned, deviated from the trail, and led Lydia straight into the truth no one had dared face. A breeze moved through, carrying pine resin and damp earth in its wake, and for a moment, time itself seemed to stand still. Lydia looked up at the sky, where the final sunlight flared once more before fading. She remembered Calloway's words from long ago. Not every dog obeys, but sometimes the ones who don't save a soul. She smiled faintly and leaned closer to whisper into Aspen's ear, her voice hushed, almost like a prayer. "If there's a world where Ryan is now, I know he knows you were there. You never left." In that gentle dusk, there were no medals, no applause, no spotlights. But Lydia understood. This was the truest moment of all. A woman and her dog, after all the storms, sitting quietly together like two pieces of a story that hadn't ended in triumph, but in understanding. And if someone happened to walk by, they might have seen just a woman and her dog at rest beneath the trees. But if they looked closer, they would have seen something more. A bond so deep, so unbreakable, that neither time, nor rules, nor even death itself could sever it. Because some truths don't need to be spoken. They just need silence and someone willing to face the light. As the last rays of that sunset vanished into the heart of Rockwell, and Lydia whispered her final words into Aspen's ear, a quiet goodbye to an old chapter, she didn't yet know that only days later, fate would bring the story full circle. A long-promised reunion was waiting. Master Sergeant Reed Calloway returned. He arrived without announcement. His old silver pickup truck rolled to a stop outside the training camp on a morning veiled in mist. He brought no fanfare, just crates of custom-made equipment, a stack of new scent-mapping blueprints he'd drawn himself, and a single, familiar line. "I think it's time Aspen tried something bigger." Lydia stepped out of the cabin, eyes wide with surprise and genuine joy, and grasped the hand of her old mentor, the man who didn't keep Aspen for the military, but instead entrusted her to the only person willing to believe in something different. Calloway knelt beside Aspen, now in her 6th year of service, still sharp-eyed, but now carrying a depth earned through memories, through unwavering loyalty. He didn't speak. He simply patted her back gently, and the three of them stood there in the sunlight-streaked yard as if past, present, and future had gathered into one perfect moment. That day's training session was not loud. No medals, no cameras, just Calloway, Lydia, and Aspen. Back to the rhythm they'd always known. Gaze replacing command, breath replacing speech. The exercise wasn't simple tracking anymore. It was layered scent recognition in chaotic terrain, a method so advanced even elite military K9s rarely attempted it. Calloway called it a living scent map, a technique he believed only a handful of dogs in the world were capable of mastering. Aspen completed the first test in less than half the expected time. Calloway nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with emotion. Not praise, recognition. She was no longer just a top student. She had become a legend forged through unwavering belief. Then, the next mission came sooner than anyone expected. A small northern town sent a formal request for assistance in a missing persons case. Signs pointed to an old crime scene buried deep in forest terrain. This time Lydia didn't wait for an assignment. She volunteered. Standing before a map of the state, her fingers traced over dozens of red pins, each one a soul still waiting. She rested her hand on a point near the cold mountain region and said softly, "We'll start here." Aspen stood beside her, ears alert, eyes bright in the morning sun. No command is needed. She understood. The journey was beginning again, but now no one could question their strength. The media no longer called Lydia and Aspen an up-and-coming investigative team. They called them the living legends of Rockwell, a symbol of trust between species, a testament that justice doesn't always come from guns or courts, but from steady paws and a heart that never quits. To those who'd seen them work, the name Aspen wasn't just a name anymore. It was a feeling, a symbol of resolve, empathy, and the courage to keep searching. That evening, as twilight settled and they prepared to depart, Lydia sat beside Aspen under the cabin's porch light. The warm glow brushed against Aspen's dark coat like a soft halo. Lydia stroked her neck gently and said, "We've come so far, but you know what? The best part is still ahead, because now we're not just searching, we're bringing the forgotten home." And Aspen, as if she heard every word, lifted her head and pressed it into Lydia's palm. Not a bark, not a wag, just a quiet touch, enough to say that the circle had closed, but the journey of love and truth would always go on. The journey of Lydia and Aspen was never just about solving a forgotten boy's case. It became proof of the bond that transcends language, of loyalty, instinct, and compassion that can break through walls of silence, lies, and guilt. They weren't just an investigative team. They were hope for souls yet to be named, and a reminder. Sometimes truth doesn't speak in words. Sometimes it lives in the heart of a creature who never gave up. And you? If faced with a hard choice, would you follow orders or trust the instincts of a companion even if that companion walked on 4 legs? If this story touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe to follow more journeys like this, stories where love, loyalty, and courage bring the truth to light. Thank you for reading. Until the next story.